would be remiss if I didn't give a quick plug to a couple of GBH podcasts. Innovation Hub, it's a great show and it's a great podcast. Frontlines, Dispatch, we have a new season coming out very soon. And at Masterpiece Studio, if you're a Masterpiece fan, you'd like Masterpiece Studio. Anyway, but that's not what we're here about. We're here to talk about audience growth. And I was very excited when Audio Boom asked me to moderate this panel because of the exciting people that they have brought together for this panel with a lot of knowledge about how to take your podcast and make it bigger. So I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and then they're going to say a little bit about where they're coming from and what they do very quickly, and then we'll get into a discussion. I just want to say I'm going to leave a really nice chunk of time at the end for your questions, because I always find that you guys have the best questions and that you have stuff that you want to know, and they can help you. So down at the end is Rob Peterson, and Rob Peterson is the Director of Audience Acquisition for Audio Boom, where he supervises the promotion of original and co-produced podcasts. And he is very currently into How I Built This. That's the podcast that he's been listening to. Sitting next to Rob is Tamar Abishai. Tamar is the host and producer of the art history podcast, The Lonely Pallet. She is also a co-founder of the Boston-based independent podcast network, Hub and Spoke. Yay, Boston. She is currently obsessed with Revolutions. That is the podcast she's listening to. Next to Tamar is Mayan Plout. Mayan is the content strategist and podcast librarian of Radio Public. That is the coolest title ever. And she is contributing writer for the Bello Collective. She listens to a lot of podcasts, as you might imagine. She is currently digging Heat and Light and Hollywood in Color. Yay, Mayan. And then Nathan Otowski is the head of marketing at How Stuff Works down in Atlanta. And he is currently listening to, and always listening to, Stuff You Should Know. So why don't we start with Rob? You can talk a little bit about what you do, and then we'll just go down.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Nina, for moderating this panel, and thank you, everyone, for attending and being on it. My name is Rob Peterson. I am the Director of Audience Acquisition at Audio Boom. I started my career in radio, local radio on Long Island, made my way to network radio with Cumulus Media, where I oversaw and helped bring on their on-demand and podcasting development and shows. From there, I moved over to Audio Boom as their Director of Audience Acquisition, where, as Nina said, I'm responsible for the growth of our original programming and some of our third-party sales shows. What that means, because Audience Acquisition is kind of a weird title, is that I have to help grow the shows. Obviously, the more listeners that we get, the better we do. And that's through a variety of ways that we'll get into today, through paid promotion and barter and all the fun stuff that we'll dive in deeper later. So thank you very much.
So I'm Tamar. I produce this show called The Lonely Pallet, which aims to make art history as accessible and unsnooty as you always wanted it to be. My day job is actually in corporate finance, which shouldn't matter, but it actually kind of does for this panel, so we'll come back to that. I wanted to be a radio producer, and I had been an art historian, and I didn't want to be an academic, and I kind of floated around for a little while, and I realized that there wasn't really any art history show yet, and so in order to practice being a radio producer, I tried to make one, and it actually ended up being something that a lot of people were pretty interested in, so that's the place that I'm in now, and completely independent, and that's why we formed Hub and Spoke, because we were all independent and we were lonely, and we wanted to really try to help each other, and so here we are.
I'm Mayan Plout, as Nina said. I'm the content strategist and podcast librarian at Radio Public. Prior to working there, I worked in higher education at Oberlin College for almost 7 years in social media marketing and content strategy. So I am one of you from before, but also now. At Radio Public, as far as I know, I'm the only podcast librarian in the world. I know this because we made up the job when I started working there. And it is, in fact, a great job. I get to listen to podcasts pretty constantly, except when I'm at work where I can't actually listen and write at the same time. But yeah, so my content strategy and podcast librarian role sort of takes on a couple of different forms. I work a lot internally with our own team, building our biggest product, which is our podcast listening app, but we also do a ton of user research with podcasters and listeners like all of you. I'm also the behind-the-scenes writer for a lot of the things that we do, and the more I write, the more I realize that what I'm working on is helping people market their podcasts, both small and big, and figuring out creative ways to do so. All of that work at Oberlin had a lot to do with how do we creatively connect with the audiences that we want to have, currently have, and futurely need to have relationships with. So it's a very long-term thing to have gone from admissions and internal communications and alumni communication at Oberlin to how we find the people that we want to find in the world of podcasting now. So I think that's it for now, but excited to be here.
Awesome. I'm Nathan Otoski. I am the head of marketing at How Stuff Works. I've been in marketing for about 18 years. Really started out with tech, entertainment, and other companies like Cox Communications, Earthlink, if you remember, getting those discs in the mail. Some of you might not. But that really started out my digital career, even though it was a direct marketing agency that I worked for. To this day, I really find what I learned back then in terms of finding audiences relevant, even though it's on a digital scale rather than making people insert a disc and getting the internet through a sound. So I've been at How Stuff Works for 3 years, and my team and I we work together to develop marketing strategies and implement them to connect audiences with our content.
Great. So we wanted to start out by kind of taking the temperature of the room and seeing where everybody was coming from. And I wonder if you could just raise your hand if you're an independent podcaster. Nice. Raise your hand if you're podcasting for an educational institution or a nonprofit. Okay. And raise your hand if you are working for an educational institution or a nonprofit and you're thinking about podcasting and trying to see if you're going to get into it. It's okay.
Brave people.
That's good. Okay. So we wanted to kind of start the conversation a little bit big and then narrow in. There are 550,000 podcasts in the universe and growing. So with all that different media that's happening, I was excited to get this group together because they come from very different points of view. We have two people who work for bigger sort of networks. We have someone who works for a discoverability app and is on that piece. And then we have someone who is a podcaster herself who also has formed a network on her own. So let's start, I think, with Rob. I'm wondering when a new podcaster comes to you, with the idea, with the show, and they're here we are, where do you even begin? How do you start, right? What do you do? I'm talking nuts and bolts here.
Sure, yeah. If I sit like this, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Hard to hunch over. I would say the number one thing is get content, right? And that's pretty obvious, but I think a lot of people think that, and I did this myself. I have a podcast that I don't do anymore for the purpose of the fact that I just sat down in front of a mic and just spoke, and no one was interested in what I had to say. So basically, I thought I was Bill Burr, and not even close to that. So basically, that's the thing you have to figure out, right? What you want to say, what you want to do, what the message you want to get across, and just kind of understand what you're trying to tell your audience and who your audience is. I think that's the most important thing to focus on immediately. That's getting in front of a mic, figuring out how to speak into a mic, figuring out how to get comfortable there, and then kind of telling your message. So go through 4 or 5 iterations. I know that seems like a lot, but it's just going to get you comfortable. Send it to your closest friends and family. Make sure that they tell you the goods and the bads of it. Everyone's going to tell you it's great. That's very nice of them, but no offense to you guys, that's probably a lie. So just figure that out and know what you want to say. And then when you come to a network like ours, we just want to see a plan of what the show is going to be. We're willing to listen to everybody, obviously, but we want to make sure that you're cohesive in your strategy, your message, and that you have something to say. A celebrity podcast where they're just kind of talking into a mic might do great initially, but you start to see those numbers really dive because they may not be as interesting as they seem on camera or anything like that. So if you have a clear message and you have a clear audience you're looking to reach, then we go from there and the secondary most important part of after your message is the branding in and of itself. So it's getting a great logo out there, something that's going to stand out in discovery apps. Like Nina said, 500,000 podcasts, that's a lot. So don't think that you're going to be number one on the charts immediately. Hopefully you do. That's obviously the goal, but the charts are, we'll talk about this later, but the charts are what they are. They're not the best, and they're not accurate to what your goals are. So set your goals, know that 1,000 listens is amazing, and then you're just going to grow from there. But yeah, I would say message, and the content will come, and you'll figure and get your feet out.
Rob, when you say like art is really important, what do you mean by that? I mean, what is your guys' experience? Like, how important is like the artwork for actually connecting with an audience?
Yeah, I think it's important. You're looking through a lot of apps on your phone, especially. That's where this discoverability is, and you're seeing like a square that you can't. Would you be able to see artwork like this from that far away? Probably not. So you need to be able to get your. I would say people want to probably throw an image up there. It's probably not the most important thing. You want to get your name out there, obviously. But use colors that are going to stand out. Look at the charts or look at other podcasts and what they're doing, and then kind of mock things up. Take screenshots. Put your logo into where you want people to find your show and see where it stands against other shows as well. That's what my suggestion would be.
Samara, I'm wondering, when you began the Lonely Pallet, like how did you think about who you were going to reach and how you were going to reach anyone? Starting from like the ground, starting from nowhere, like what was your plan? How did you start?
It's funny, when you do something every day for 2.5 years, you totally forget what the origin story is because it keeps getting eclipsed by the new experience. And so I was talking to my husband about it, and I was like, I set out to do an art history podcast, right? And he was like, actually, no. Like, you wanted to practice your audio chops, which is actually, so, when I actually released the first episode, I wasn't even on iTunes yet because I didn't know how. I mean, I told a bunch of my friends and I emailed them and I said, please tell the world that this is something that I'm going to do. And I'm going to release an episode every 2 weeks and it's going to be great. And that, very quickly, I realized how much time hustling to get out the product. It's like, I completely agree that content is 100% of what makes a really good podcast, and also hustling it is 100% of how you get it out there. And that's why it's been a pretty stressful few years.
And when you say hustling it, what do you mean by that? Like,
I mean, I wanted to get on every social media platform. I actually barely was on Twitter before. I didn't even gram before before this show, and I started to just see what would happen if I led with the brand. And I always felt like, it's funny, like, a couple times early on when I started to get some write-ups, I didn't feel like seeing my own name in print mattered. It was about seeing the Lonely Pallet in print. And I knew who I was. I was just trying to figure this out. But seeing the Lonely Pallet out there made it feel like it was a thing, and that was really exciting. But the actual kind of early stages of the process was just, I want to make something like what I hear. And that means that, if I'm good at this, and I think I'm good at this, so if I'm actually good at this, then it means that I have a good ear for the pacing and really the sound, and I want it to sound professional. And I don't just want to get, I want the writing to be really sound, but the writing I felt like was already something that I knew how to do. I didn't know how to edit. I didn't know how to write for radio. I didn't know how to hear my own voice yet. That took a lot, to just kind of listen to my own voice endlessly until I got over that mortification and could actually be comfortable with it and not be bothered by that. And it just was a really, really slow process. Like the first time I was on an iTunes chart was really, really exciting, but it took like 1.5 years. And looking back on it, I wouldn't want to have gone viral. Like, that's a really scary thing to do because then there's nowhere to go but down. It was like every step of it was a really slow accumulation of kind of learning as I went. And the early stuff nobody heard because no one was listening yet, so it could be crap. And I could still just kind of put it out little by little.
Do you remember like the first episode where you were like, oh, this is a podcast, where you were putting it together and you had kind of a moment?
It was actually the first episode, but that, it was like, it was the first, like, I felt like I had accomplished what I wanted to do. And then there were a few episodes after that I was like, okay, how do I keep it at that place? And that was scary. But I felt like episode 1 was, like they say with musicians, the first, you have, 25 years to write your first album and 11 months to write your second one. So that's kind of how it felt, was that like, everything had been poured into the very beginning, and then keeping that going was the tough part.
And in terms of like tips for just getting more audience members, when you're coming from nowhere and you have like a certain small circle, like what were some of the practical things you were doing? Was it like posting the episodes on Facebook, or like what did you actually see results from, and how did that work?
Getting a website right away, having a really professional looking place that I could point people to, so that even if I wasn't entirely sure about the content, I knew that it was being delivered in a way that had some finish to it. And just kind of getting that piece of it out there. I don't understand how people put out podcasts without websites, like without a place to actually link back to. It doesn't strike me, and maybe I'm a little old-fashioned, but it doesn't strike me as professional.
Mm-hmm. So Nathan, I just want to turn to you. You head up like a network with a lot of different podcasts that cover a lot of different subjects. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that we have all talked about before is a way to grow your audience is cross-promotion. So the best way of growing your audience is putting your podcast on another podcast, or like of having a mention.
Right.
I'm wondering if you can talk with that experience. So you have like every podcast from like Stuff You Should Know to like Ken Jennings' podcast to like all sorts of random, like topics. How does cross-promotion work for you guys, and what have you seen that's worked and what hasn't? And Marianne, I think you can talk to that too as well. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, sure. So we currently have about 50 podcasts. So the biggest one being Stuff You Should Know. And so what we tend to focus on is testing, and that's actually, if there's one thing I learned from my early days of marketing, it's test, and find out what works. And so a lot of what we'll start out with is, on the bigger side. Even if it's a niche show, let's get it on Stuff You Should Know. Let's get it on Stuff You Missed in History Class. Let's be intentional, and let's see what works, and let's see what sort of audience sticks, because, anybody could listen to Stuff You Should Know, but not everybody's going to listen to, like, an anime podcast. So, but there are people who listen to Stuff You Should Know who love anime. So it's just finding those people. And so we start out big, and then we see what works, and then we move on and we become a little more focused, and we look at, so where's a match within the network? And so then we'll look at that as well. But then, because we do have so much, with a lot of our larger shows, we're able to take some of that internal cross-promotion and look to some of our partners who maybe have a show that matches a little bit better. So I'll talk to Rob. I work with Maggie at PRX, the marketing person there, and we'll exchange promos so that, maybe this show's a little too niche for our audience. And so I'll go over to some of our partners, which I actually find is one of the most refreshing things being in marketing, where podcasting is still so new, where we can still all be friends, where people aren't yelling at each other or like secretly, that sort of thing. It's been so nice coming from, I've worked in the video game industry where no one talked to each other, where Rob and I, talk at least once a month about what's coming up, what sort of partnerships we can do. I talk to, every time there's a convention or something, I'm talking to somebody within the industry about, hey, what's working for you? So I do find that very refreshing and great. But then, some of the other things that we can do, which we found really worked and has been kind of a weird, it hasn't been expected, is guest spots. So being able to take like we recently had one of our LA-based comedy shows. It's called Culture Kings. They talk about culture, race, the NBA, and comedy, of course. They're Upright Citizens Brigade comedians. And they came to us like, we'd really love to partner with one of the headquartered shows in Atlanta and get a little promotion out of it. And they kind of feel like they're out on an island in Los Angeles. So actually, they had just done a show about debunking conspiracies. And our conspiracy podcast, Stuff They Don't Want You to Know, had heard that and was like, oh, we'd love to partner with them. And so they actually came on their show and did a conspiracy show about, there's a conspiracy about Michael Jordan the first time he retired, and why did he retire? Maybe he was forced out. And it was great. The chemistry was there. It really worked well. And you wouldn't necessarily think conspiracy and, more of a cultural comedian-based podcast would really mesh. But it turned into, at the end, they were sending rap beefs back and forth through social media. And it ended up being the highest episode for Stuff They Don't Want You to Know downloaded for October, and also gave Culture Kings a great lift. So, just experimenting and knowing that, even though you might think, oh, that's not a great fit, just try it. It's, at least you tried it, and then you can step back and say, yeah, that didn't work, but at least we tried.
Yeah, and you've been writing notes.
Oh, I've been writing so many notes. So, all of the advice you've been hearing so far is really good, but I know that very few of you here are probably in networks already and are probably, rather than top-down, able to go to your biggest possible show, rather going from yourself and your small but mighty audience up. So I'm going to sort of draw together both what Rob was saying around knowing yourself and what Nathan was saying around working together. Right now, everyone in this room is your peer. Talk to everybody and learn what their show is and figure out what your connection is. Because if you know who you are and they know who they are, there's a chance that you can figure out how to work together and spread your show from audience to audience. I love, love, love hearing that guesting is a way in which you're hearing that this is working really well. Because where I come from when I talk about audience development is actually less so people who already listen to podcasts, which is where podcast cross-promotion works best, is rather to think about where your future listeners, aka people who've never heard a podcast before, are going to come from first. So I also loved the way that you were talking about websites. I look at so many podcasts on a regular basis, and so few of them have websites. And the ones that have websites are not necessarily always updated, and your website is your front door for people who don't know what podcasts are. The first thing they're going to do is not go to a podcast listening app because they don't necessarily know what that is yet. They're going to Google the name of your podcast and hopefully land on a website. Right. And that website needs to have a guide on how people can listen to your show. Please, 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 if you have one takeaway from what we're talking about today, make sure that people who land on your site, which you need to have, also know how to listen to your podcast for the first time. So,
do you know, is there a good example that you can send people to? Who does it well? I know Ireland has a little video about how to download.
So I actually wrote a guide on how to write how to listen guides recently, and the two examples that I use in there, one of them is our friend Jelinka, who's sitting in the back there. 70 Million has an excellent page because they rightfully identify that the people who they want to listen to their show the most definitely have no idea what a podcast is. So theirs is great, and I also always bring up the Rashomon podcast, which is a podcast in which a story is told by every member, one particular moment is told by every member of the same family, and then it's spliced together into a narrative. She has a very excellent, it's just a step-by-step guide, and it sounds exactly like her, which is why I always use it as an example. So those two, check them out. Where was I going with this? So the knowing yourself and your working togetherness, I would challenge all of you, if you're at your first panel of the whole conference, my challenge to you is to figure out at least one connection while you're here that you can do something together. And by all means, have it be someone who's aligned with your show. If you're talking about ancient history, find another ancient history person. That's great. You're going to reach the exact audience that you're looking for. However, I challenge you to try and find somebody who is one step off from you. So if you're ancient history, maybe find someone who talks about books. If you're, I don't know, just one step off, because that is where you're audience sharing. You're going to get to slightly different people who might not know that your show exists. It's more likely that the same things will find each other, but I'm looking at the same off by one. The more the web of what we are thinking about. So I think that was a little roundabout, but that's what I'm going at for now.
Tips. You guys, Nate and Rob, Nathan and Rob, have big networks, but I was curious a little bit about the origins of Hub and Spoke, because it's a really interesting model of audience growth and gathering together some independent podcasters to sort of spread the word. And I wonder if you could take us through how you guys came together, why you came together and how it's worked, actually. Or not worked, I don't know.
I think it's worked. So far, so good. I mean, we have pins.
Pins is like the sign.
We have
swag.
Merch.
So there's an incredibly robust radio community in Boston. And when I was first kind of invited, I was added to a listserv by a friend of mine who doesn't even live in Boston anymore, called the Sonic Soiree. And it's just, anytime a job or somebody promoting a new show comes out, it goes through the listserv. And there's also a monthly potluck where we all get together and we listen to each other's shows and just like totally, it's like connecting and networking and also feedback and polishing, and it's a really awesome space. And when I first started it, when I first started going, I was terrified because I was surrounded by radio producers, and it's interesting because in the last couple of years, it's really become very podcast producer heavy. And so that's, we're kind of figuring out that shift as it's happening also. But when I put out the first episode of The Lonely Pallet, I emailed the listserv, I swallowed hard and I sent it out. And I got an email back from a very lovely gentleman, Wade Roush, who had listened to it, and he said, I really like what you're doing. I'm putting out my own show soonish, and I would love to just kind of have you as like a buddy that we can talk about this stuff with. And he invited me to be on his show. He interviewed me because he was doing an episode on the future of art museums, and asked if and we had an hour-and-a-half long interview where we got to the depths of each other's souls, and it was really great. It's like by the end of it, we were really tight. And I put out my show, he put out his show, and I don't know, maybe 8 months later, he emailed me again and said, we should do something. Like, we should get together. Like, we don't know what podcasting is, the Wild West, that's what everybody's calling it. And, why not form a collective? Why not, it's not a network, we don't have to worry about money, we don't have to worry about, a nonprofit status or a board. Let's just get a landing page. Let's pay for some branding and start something, pick up some more shows, and see what happens. And the entire time, it's just been, let's see what happens. And we now have 6 shows, including Ministry of Ideas, which, it really helps. The more people are also pretty entrepreneurial. And we've just kind of, this whole time, there's still a sense of let's see what happens. But it's amazing how when you pay for some branding, which is pretty much all we really put money into, branding and pins, is that we now have a thing. It's like when the Bellow Collective released their 100 outstanding pieces of audio from 2016 to 2017. They do it every year. And I was fortunate enough to be on it both times. But the first year, under my name, was independent. And we realized that doesn't look good right now, that we're trying to figure out, or at least at the time, in 2016, we felt like independent, the more shows that are out there, the more that says that you're just kind of floating on your own, and maybe it's not good. Maybe it's, it's nice to be on a list, but otherwise to be an independent podcaster in a time when, oh, you've got a podcast, so does my cousin. Oh, great, I'm thinking about starting one too. It'll be great, we'll all have podcasts. It was nice to feel like having the name independent didn't feel like it was helping me. And the second time I got on it, it said Hub and Spoke underneath, and it felt like being part of something that was only something that we decided would be a thing. It was like, but it helped to really differentiate us. And as we're figuring out what it means, we're talking about criteria and what we are very selective about the shows that we want to add, not because we want to be, elitist in any way, but because we're doing something similar. We want to put out high quality shows that put a lot of energy into production value, a lot of energy into having a host that feels really compelling. And it means that we are able to kind of build this brand and this platform that maybe we might be able to turn into a network. There's this see what happens feeling. Everybody's really excited about it. And we help each other out. We have a Slack channel, and we're just excited for each other all the time. You know, whenever somebody gets on a list or gets, you know, some sort of recognition somehow, or even just puts out a new episode, you know, like we get a little like rocket ship or a little like party emoji, you know, but it's like, it just feels like we have a community all the time that's supporting us. And that's really helpful when otherwise you just feel like you're floating out in space and you're all alone. You know, everybody, almost all of our shows are pretty much one-man, one-woman bands. And so it just feels like we have a community.
Yeah, so it's giving you the sense of community, of like help both creatively, you are able to like bounce ideas off of each other. And I'm wondering, like, from the sort of, the practical sense, like, have you seen it help with audience numbers? Like, have you seen, like, you guys?
Well, so I told a great story at Third Coast, and now Barry's here, and I can actually say it here. We make sure, and I should have said this, one of the criteria is that you do a little advertising spot. You know, you plug someone else's Hub and Spoke show in every one of your episodes. So we're always kind of working for that, you know, infinite growth potential. And Barry Lamb from Hi-Fi Nation is here, and he was on an IndieWire list of top 50 podcast episodes. And that episode happened to have plugged the Lonely Pallet. And I actually, you know, we were all really happy for him, but I saw a bump too. And I looked at, you know, and I was like, oh, wow, why is that? And I was like, oh, it's that episode. Like, that's, you know, and that was so cool. It was really, really exciting that, you know, like that's a very specific example of you know, a good press mention. But in general, I feel like it's not even just, oh, soonish I heard about it on Lonely Pallet, Hi-Fi Nation I heard about it on Ministry of Ideas. It's, oh, Hub and Spoke. I've heard of those shows. And that's actually, I feel like, has been more of a material bump, that people feel like our collective, it's like, you know, you see on Twitter, I'm going to listen to some, you know, at Hub and Spoke shows. And it's like, again, we made a thing that we, you know, just to like, we said it was, and it was. And that was really exciting.
So there's lots of buzzwords in podcasting, and one of them is discoverability. I hate that word, but I'm going to use it. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about discoverability. And one of the things actually that I've heard all of you guys talk a little bit about is press coverage. Like, you all have been able to get into, you know, getting that IndieWire, like, listing, getting on in the Bellow Collective, like, listing, and I'm wondering, how do you do that? Like, how do you even get press? How do you go about cultivating those relationships? Like, what are you doing to get in the newsletters, all that stuff? Whomever wants to take that can go.
I'll start happily, in part because so much of podcast marketing to me is helping people who are helping themselves. And I just circled it really big on my note card because I wrote it down as soon as we started talking that I wanted to make sure to mention it. So I did harp on websites briefly, but the thing that has compelled me to listen to podcasts the most is people who actually think about the fact that it's not just like putting things out there and hoping someone will find it, but actually actively advocating for their own show. By all means, advocate for other shows too while you're advocating for yourself, but like make sure that you talk about your show. And when I say that, it's everywhere. It's when you meet somebody, it's when you email someone, having it in your email signature. It's if you're doing social media either personally or as a brand, like those things. Like, it's all very small day-to-day maintenances of having something. But that, to me, as I am seeing what kinds of shows are out there and where they are going, that is a signal to me that you're serious about your own growth. Even if you can't reach a lot of people yet, you're at least starting to establish yourself as a person who is producing things regularly. I can't speak for any publications because I don't really write for that many of them, beyond sometimes Bellow Collective and occasionally Once Upon a Time for Salon, but people who are already helping themselves were the easiest ones to be able to help more. So that's my whole
Meaning,
take.
like, a lot of people will pitch you guys at Bellow Collective, like, hey, we have a new episode, or hey, like, just being active.
I'm going to just point at Ashley over there in the corner, or Galen or Dana, wherever they are.
Ashley or Galen.
Yeah, so just like, I'm not the person to pitch at the Bellow Collective, but I will say, as someone who is working for an app that has a discoverability element, I am getting shows coming to me all of the time that are just saying, hi, I'm this show. And that's all I hear, and I don't know, like, I don't have time to listen. I don't know what else I need to be getting. Like, Tell me anything. Tell me who you're trying to reach. Tell me what your show is about. Tell me what episode to start with. And even if I can't listen to it, I can start to pass it along to other people that I know. So yes, I will, again, I'll like pull out 70 million because I've been so impressed with what I've been receiving from them. Every single week, a new episode comes out. Every single week, there is an email newsletter reminding me that an episode just came out. And there is more in there and like depth and thought that is similarly present in all of the episodes. And as a result, I don't have time to listen to many things. I have listened to almost every episode of 70 million. We love you too. So, just like,
Yeah, 70 million.
sure. This is just to say that just because you have pressed play on pressed publish on a particular episode, you're not done. I'm sorry to tell you this. I know there's a lot of work that goes into making a podcast, but having a plan, either as you are creating the thing or after you've published it, like you should have at least a week on either side of your hitting publish button that is really heavily focused on making sure that that particular episode, this newest thing that you've made, the thing that you are putting your energy toward is getting out into the world in as many possible ways as you have access to. So I know it's hard. Like, I'm going to caveat that by saying, like, it's great for me to say all of this, but also many of you are working by yourselves. This is where, like, your partnerships and friendships are really helpful. And I'm going to put in, like, a serious plug for anyone who works for or with an educational institution. There's a very good chance that you have people in your community who can help you do this. As a former communications office person, I loved it when people came to me and said, I just did this. Here's why it's important. Here's what was great about it. Like, can you help me? Again, helping people who are helping themselves. Just being on a podcast episode was not enough for us. Like, if we found it out there in the world, it was much harder to figure out what we're going to do with it than someone coming to us and saying, hey, I was a guest on this show. This is their audience. Here's how you can listen to it. Here's all the other pieces of that. So if any of you work at educational institutions or like have podcasts that are connected to them, I'm more than happy to help you figure out how to navigate your communications teams. Like, that is the thing that I used to do.
Does anybody else have a comment about
Yeah,
how you deal with press?
I just want to jump in quick. I think what you said is great, and I agree with everything. I think one other thing that you should really tap into is your own audience itself. We have 3 shows with like fan bases that are unbelievable, are active on social like crazy, and honestly, I think there is an idea, at least from a network standpoint, that we get a lot of coverage. A lot of networks do, but we had 2 shows in IndieWire. Humble brag. I'm just kidding. And we did, and honestly, we did nothing. We didn't reach out to IndieWire or anything. It was 100% because of their fans. Those shows, because we're on an audience growth panel, are Blank Check and Mission to Zix, if anyone listens to those. But their fan bases are constantly talking about them, constantly sharing fan art, constantly engaging with them on social. They're constantly talking to them too, and they've really built communities that have allowed them to kind of gain attraction and find ways to get into press coverage. And Blank Check especially gets featured on a lot of things, and we're thankful for that. And that's honestly because of the fan base that they've created. So, just like everyone has kind of echoed here, make sure that you have the content that people want to listen to. Make sure that you have a presence on web. Make sure people can find you. But the most important thing is making sure that you're talking to your audience. It seems like something that you might not be able to make time for, but if you retweet somebody that's a fan of your show, they're a fan of you. So they're going to be, you're almost like a pseudo celebrity. They're going to be very excited about that, and that's more of a reason that they're going to share your stories and your artwork and the other fans. And you're creating communities on Reddit and all these other places that are just going to bring your show up to another level. And then those IndieWire, we'll just keep using them. They're going to not want to miss that momentum and want to make sure that they're talking about your show. So it's a lot of work. And again, in this room, there's a lot of independent podcasters that are doing it by themselves. But your fan base are your biggest advocates, and they're going to market like crazy for you. So I would just wanted to add that.
Yeah. Well, I'll say, as kind of the representative of like the really small, scrappy show, I slid into a lot of DMs. Like I got on Twitter and I started tweeting at anybody who might be interested in the show. How
did you do that? Like, what did you talk about?
Yeah, that's so like.
I honestly just at like, hey, I've got this show. Here's the website. Yeah. Like it was really, hey, interested in art history, like, and like you. It's like dating. I mean, it's like 99 times out of 100, like nobody responded. But then you get that one. Like it just, it was amazing how much. Tweet that. I know. That's a little bit too much personal. No, but like it was actually really incredible how every now and then somebody would say, "Oh, I found you on Twitter because of that." Kind of doing that work. I saw what other shows did, and I copied it.
Yeah.
I tried to just. I actually got. I was at the PRX holiday party, which I had some. I don't even think I got invited to that year. I just went with as a guest of somebody. And I happened to be, it was the year that Leonard Cohen had just died, and we were all singing Hallelujah, and we were all sharing lyrics because there weren't enough copies. And the woman that I was sharing lyrics with happened to be the host of an arts show on NHPR. And I recognized her name, and I said, hey. I was that one who was adding harmonies, because I sing, and here's my card, and we should get in touch. And 3 weeks later, I was reporting on her show. So it was like any opportunity. I don't know where this little backbone came from, because I hate asking people for money. I hate asking people, I never thought I would be a good self-promoter, but going back to the content, I believed in the content. I felt like I had a good show, and I really wanted it out there. And I got 1,000 business cards, and I just showered the community with them. I went on a tour of NPR, and in DC, and I would just kind of leave cards here and there. I don't think anything happened, but maybe someday I'll get a call that, somebody found a card. I became really shameless, and the word shameless started to turn into strategic. It's like at first I stopped feeling bad about myself, and I kind of turned it into, I am my own marketing department, and this is part of the deal if I'm going to get people listening to this show. And then you get one mention, and that leads to another mention, and suddenly I got a write-up in Wired, and that was thrilling. Yeah. And it changed things. It's like suddenly, because I had a really niche show, unfortunately, I'm going to be on facilitating a panel later today on arts podcasts, and a few of us kind of came around the same time, and it was pretty clear that, if Art Curious gets a write-up, I'm not getting that write-up, because it's such a niche business to be doing art history podcasts. And so you recognize your community, but also your competition, and how to kind of navigate that. And I think we all still felt like the tide was lifting, all of us. But yeah, just shamelessly promoting yourself all the time.
And you were writing some notes?
Oh, no, I was just writing, I love the phrase shameless, promotion turns strategic, because it does connect to how you were talking about experimentation. Mm-hmm. That you have to at least try something, and if it doesn't work, you reassess and go on.
At least you tried it.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's really I have been amazed by, and the number of things that have come out, especially in the last 2 years since I started working at Radio Public, is just the breadth of things that are happening in the podcast world and how people are thinking about who those things are for. I must say I do not make a podcast, so I have no idea how hard the thing that I'm about to say is. But as one is making something, thinking about who that thing is for and how it is going to be felt and heard by them does help with marketing your show. So it is knowing your content, but it is also very much knowing who is going to feel this? What do they need to know? How are they going to find out about this? That's to me, it's always in the back of my head whenever I'm making anything, and I know it's not necessarily a natural trait for everybody, but it's been a question that I've asked of many, many people who are on the very early stages of either figuring out if they're going to make a show, they have just launched their show, is figuring out who is it for? Just asking yourself that question every time you make an episode, not even just your show broadly, but for every episode there is somebody who will love that particular thing, and it's figuring out how you're going to speak to them, whether it be via email or Twitter or Instagram, or walking over to their house and saying, I think you would like this. Maybe don't do that one, it'd be a little creepy.
Depends on the neighborhood.
It does depend on the neighborhood, but it's the kind of thing where I used to work on a college campus, posters are everything. Yeah. It is entirely possible that your local coffee shop is a place to talk about your podcast. So,
creative ideas.
Sure, I have all of them, apparently.
So we've been talking a lot about growing a podcast vis-a-vis numbers and sort of a bigger audience, but I feel like that's maybe too narrow of a way to think about what is success for a podcast. And I was curious for you guys to talk a little bit about how have you seen people define success and audience development in different ways?
Yeah, I could.
Go ahead.
I can start it off. I think if there's one thing that we have reiterated over and over again, it's content. And so it really depends on when you're making your podcast, what is your objective? So is your objective to make a living off of your podcast, or is your objective to educate, your fellow beekeeper society for a bi-monthly or, every month you put out a podcast for your society? If you can reach all of those people within your society, that's a success. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to make a living off it, then you're going to have to hustle. You're going to do a lot of what all of these people have said. And it's not easy. It's going to take some time. But I think one of the easiest things is to create a podcast about things that you know, that you're familiar with. You know the content, you're passionate about the content, and that will always show through. And that is what really drives people to your podcast. Even though, logo will help, cross-promotion will definitely help. But, how many of us have been turned on to podcasts because our friends post something on social media saying, new podcast, go. And everybody chimes in with 10 to 15 new podcasts. And word of mouth is huge. And if you can affect those people, you're going to affect everybody. So in that part, you would be a success as well.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's just you have to kind of define it yourself. I'm just going to, basically what Nathan took the words right out of my mouth. It's based on what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to achieve a huge success, then yeah, you're going to have to hustle. You're going to have to do everything what we've been talking about, plus more. But I think that if you're looking to reach 500 people and it continues to grow from there, I think that depends on what you want to say. I think that there are shows that have 1,000 listens and are doing great and they're very happy with the content they're putting out there, and there's shows that are doing 1 million listens and they have to kind of go into the studio and they have to do another episode. So it's really what you're achieving and what you want to get out of it, as opposed to like, oh, I'm going to do the next big podcast. And that's kind of, I would say success driven by metrics is probably a failing proposition. I would say make sure, again, I know I keep saying this, but content is king, and it's going to be something that's going to drive you and drive your passion to make you want to continue to do it. And I think that is more of a success, and that will help you want to promote the show and want to make it grow.
I will say just one thing around metrics that, I don't want to utter the word apple charts here, but I feel like I have to right now.
I'm going to go into that.
Okay, great.
I want to segue in.
I just want to put in a small plug for meaningful metrics, just thinking about what are you trying to accomplish with your show and how are you going to get there? Again, I came from the strategy world before this, and now there's something called SMART goals. I don't know if you know about these, just look them up after this. And it is figuring out how to make strategic, measurable, actionable, something, and I've lost both of them. But actually helping put constraints around the thing you're trying to do, which is, I'm trying to grow my podcast is an excellent sentence, but I'm trying to grow my podcast by doing this, by this date, for this particular group, is a much more specific version of how this could work. So there will be numbers involved, but the numbers around that particular goal is setting yourself up for some frameworks of where you can start to put your time or energy or money to help you get to the thing you're trying to do.
Yeah, I define success by 3 phone calls that I get after every episode I release. One is from my dad, who is a journalist and and a professor, but as a journalist, he will tell me if my argument worked. That's what I'm waiting. I'm waiting for that call. I'm waiting for, maybe an email from my advisor in grad school, my art history advisor, who doesn't understand podcasting and doesn't really get it and thinks that, where are all the footnotes? It's that kind of academic, if she says that was a really beautiful way of putting it, then And the third is my mom, who's an artist. And she'll say that she saw something new in the art that she does because of learning a little bit about the history. And all 3 of those conversations feel like this is why I do this. And I feel like the metrics themselves, they'll work themselves out somehow. I mean, I know this is about audience growth, but that piece of it feels like it's about the content, and it keeps me honest about the content, that that's what really, really matters, and that as long as there's something good, that it will get put in the right hands, or as many hands as possible, because it means that I'm reaching, I didn't go into this trying to reach any one audience. I was like, everybody has that, like everybody could learn about art
It's
history.
also code for nobody.
Well, I'm glad I didn't talk to you 2.5 years ago. But it's like that's who I've started to realize my audience is. Students who want to learn more about this stuff and need little cliff notes, and professors who use them as teaching tools, and artists who listen in their studios as they're making art, and then just like people who like a good argument, who tend to be people who listen to podcasts. Like those are the three calls, and that's how I know that like it was a good episode.
So we've been talking a lot about reaching people who are already kind of listening to podcasts, and though Edison research has saying that podcast is growing, it's still kind of a very small sandbox. And I'm wondering what techniques or what things you have seen to reach people who aren't sort of in the sandbox already, but who are maybe could get in. What have you seen podcasters do, or what have you done yourselves or with your networks to reach people who aren't, on their Apple or whatever, Android, whatever, Stitcher, whatever. A lot of whatevers.
I guess I can start this one off. So I think that is a very tough proposition. Number one, being a part of a larger network, I have the luxury of having relationships with Apple, Spotify, all the major platforms. If there's one thing I try to impart on them every time that I talk to them, it's what are you going to do to educate more of the people that already have your platform but are not listening to podcasts? I think one of the biggest missed opportunities, well, maybe I shouldn't say this.
Just go ahead.
So nobody tweet about this. But, if you think about, especially in the US, Apple has, tens, if not hundreds of millions of devices in people's hands. And the money that they've put behind actually trying to educate the populace of people who own their devices on podcasts is very minimal. And that is something that they could do very easily. So, sorry, Steve. The other, Steve Wilson, podcaster. So the other thing, too, is, if anyone is familiar with this, How Stuff Works was recently acquired by iHeartMedia. So this is something I feel like we're going to see more of, where media companies see an opportunity to really grow an audience through putting more of How Stuff Works content within the iHeartRadio stations across the US. We're super excited about that, especially trying to get, we announced the next season of Atlanta Monster, which will just be called Monster, will actually be broadcast first on iHeartRadio stations.
Oh, wow.
So what we're hoping is that, it will be a part, as with anything, any adoption, it always involves education. I was at a bat mitzvah a month ago and was talking to the bat mitzvah's grandmother about what I now do in Atlanta. And she's like, oh, what's a podcast? And her sister pulls out her phone, is like, oh, I listen to Fresh Air, I listen to... And so a lot of it, even though you might think, well, they don't get it, she just showed you that she got it. So a lot of it, again, is going to be word of mouth. It's going to be everywhere from word of mouth all the way to, potentially all of these networks getting together because a platform hasn't stepped forward and said, okay, we're going to come together and we're going to put aside some money and we're going to try and educate the masses on how we can convert you to listen. So I think that's somewhat of the larger approach on what we've been thinking.
And I'm going to give a bottom-up example that I totally love, which is a woman who does a TV history podcast, moved into a new neighborhood, learned that there was a book group of people who were her exact target audience. And the first time she went, asked if people listen to podcasts, and all. I'm like, well, I think I know what that word means, but I don't actually know how they work. And she filed this away in the back of her head, and then came to the meeting the next time with her laptop and like walked everyone through the process of listening to a specific episode of her show. And I'm going to put in the Radio Public plug, which is the only reason why I know that this happened, is that the her show page on the web allowed her to text the show to every single person that was there just by typing in their phone number into a web page, which is like, I don't know, I use this thing all the time. Again, shameless plug. But it meant that she got her show and a very specific episode of her show into the hands of 20 people that absolutely were the right audience for her show and had zero idea of how to actually get to it. So I think, again, going back to knowing your content and knowing who it is for, sometimes it's physically putting yourself in the room with the exact group of people that you're looking for. So just to throw out a couple of places that might happen, your student lounge on your college campus, a coffee shop,
Right.
dropping by, visiting an old professor and like saying like, hey, I'd love to like come visit your class one day and also talk about where and how your work fits into my work and like we can get everybody here listening. Like it is like, it sounds very small, but if you are the first podcast that somebody listens to, you will forever be their first podcast that they listen to, which will be the best marketing you will ever have for your show.
Yeah, like they don't know yet that they could be listening to anything else.
Yeah, like they know your show.
So whenever, they'll go through your whole catalog and they'll, ooh, new episode. Like, like I was with This American Life in 2005. That was the one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not above, I work with a lot of people in my job in corporate finance, which I think actually the connecting point is that gave me the backbone. I was used to being around a lot of people who just had no problem talking about money and talking about themselves. And they're very nice people, but, it was just like, hey, I can do that too. Why not? But yeah, the number of them who say that they're really excited to watch my blog is appalling. And so I will take their phones and show them the podcast app that, sorry, Apple, but I will show them the app and say, here it is, search for the Lonely Pallet. Hey, you're a thing. Yes, I am. Here, boop, subscribe.
You're now subscribed.
And it just kind of, I do that a lot. And that is, I wish I had more of a strategic plan for how to actually get the show into hands of people who don't, it's really a, one person at a time.
Yeah.
But I do that a lot.
I know, just to step into what you were both saying, so Happier with Gretchen Rubin, so she's an author as well. When she does her press tours, she prints out a guide on how to listen to her podcast.
That's awesome.
So on the front it says, here's my new book. On the back, now listen to Happier with Gretchen Rubin,
Cool.
and here's how you do it. So, everybody, anyone who is smart about it is going to do something like that. It's shameless self-promotion.
Yeah. I do it a lot with people's Amazon Echo. Just
Just walk into their room.
Play this episode.
Yeah.
So I wanted to leave some time for questions. If anybody had questions, raise your hand. I'll come to you with the mic.
Thank you. Building on that last question, actually, looking around the audience, I think if the podcast is a bell curve, we're all sitting on the top generationally, Gen X, maybe younger boomer, older millennial, and you were just talking about how you get probably more of the boomer generation, but just from what I gather, millennials are more diverse, maybe not as interested in subscription. How do you skew young to get your stuff?
Yeah, for my network, it's just all about, again, it's about content. I think the more you try to reach a specific audience, the more opportunity you have for failure, because you shouldn't be creating anything for anyone except yourself. And so that's really, like we've always said, content is king, but it's going to be much harder. It's going to be much harder for you if you're trying to create content for a specific audience. We've done branded content podcasts that we thought were going to be super huge hits because they had a celebrity and they had, it was around this subject. Mm-hmm. But honestly, if, Stuff to Blow Your Mind is like our weird science podcast. And if you just have them interview a geneticist about something, it's going to get, hundreds of thousands more downloads than if we tried to do a branded content podcast about the same sort of thing with celebrities talking about it. So I would say, especially from my point of view, it's all about the content, and the audience, will, across all generations will come to it if there's an interest in it.
I will also just say, having done the content strategy for like high school students, their ability to sniff out ungenuineness is probably more so than all of the rest of us put together, which is, again, going back to the content and why you're making it, is if you don't feel it and you are not conveying that through what you're saying, there's no way they're going to listen. And not to like speak for all of the young people who are out there in the world of like getting to podcasts, but I think the realness factor and the relevance factor is probably more so than anything else for that particular group. So it's a hard thing if you're not in that particular audience to know how to reach them, but I think the feeling that you can convey around the reason why you care and the reason why you feel that it's important can really help you.
And keep the episodes short.
Short's great.
Like, just a hot tip. Like, people don't listen for an hour anymore. What is short? What did Michael Barbaro say? Like 22 minutes? Like, that's the optimal. I mean, I don't know how long that's going to be. Because, it's like people would rather listen to 2 episodes of something than an hour or something. I think that's kind of I know I feel that way, at least. I feel like I've accomplished more by listening to 2 episodes of a short show.
Hi, we have a podcast called Ashes Ashes. We do have a website. It's ashesashes.org.
A+, man, A+.
I took notes right here. So. But the question is, we're considering doing a Patreon as a revenue source, but I'm curious, how useful is that in terms of just general discoverability, if at all?
Please.
I think it depends, honestly. I think that goes back to your fan base. If the fans are willing to support you financially, they're probably going to be willing to support you in the show's growth. So I think it's about, during the show, asking people to rate and review, asking them to share it on social, tweet things out, or share things on social that they're going to want to share. Maybe it's an extension of a show. Maybe it's a bonus episode that you put on Patreon, and people are going to say, oh my God, the stuff they're putting out daily on Patreon is something you really have to check out. And I think that's just going to lead to the larger narrative and then coming back to your show overall. I would say that's not going to be a silver bullet, but I think that if you have the proof of concept that your fans are there and they really are passionate about your show enough to support you, again, financially, I think that shows that they're probably going to go another step beyond that and help support you when you're looking for growth in whatever way you think that's the best way to go about it.
Yeah, Patreon is a living thing. It's like a plant. Like, if you don't tend to it, it dies. Nobody, it's one thing to push out an episode and have people care, but you really have to push the Patreon piece also. And I think that I see so many people who I think have really successful shows, and then I go to their Patreon page and they have 5 patrons. And it's like, how is that possible? I thought everyone would want to support you, and it's like, you need to push it in front of people's faces. And I actually invested a lot into Patreon before I rolled it out. I got a lot of swag. I had 100 mugs in my basement and stickers, and just I did it the only way I knew how, which was the public radio pledge drive kind of way. I have tote bags. I really wanted to make it clear that at the very that I knew that this was an investment for me, and that the overhead piece was about getting it out there, because even if you lose $1,000 on swag, kind of lose it at first, that's still 100 mugs out there in people's hands, and who can, it's it really took money to make money on Patreon, and I'm really glad I made that investment, and also, another thing, people make their tiers too small. So there's this weird thing on Patreon where because we're all artists and people feel weird about asking for money, it's well, if I really support your show, $2, but if I really, really support your show, I'll give you $5. It's I have a $50 maybe there are people out there who will pay you $50, $25, $50, $100 an episode. And, you're not going to find them right away, and you'll get that email randomly, and it'll make your day. But I think that people have a tendency to really sell themselves short on these kinds of things, and that it's, just put it out there. It doesn't cost you anything to have a $50 tier, and then someday someone will click on it and have good stuff. to kind of send out to them and make it feel like it's worth their while. People do this thing with like pledge drives, I know I do, where it's like, oh, I'm totally happy to support, BUR for $5 a month, but like at the end of $120, I only get a cookbook, like, and it's like, I'm paying more than that, and it's like, no, you're paying for the radio. The cookbook is just the gift that they, and so I found that for myself psychologically, I wanted to give people, kind of make them feel like they were buying the swag.
Mm-hmm.
And that has actually upped my patron count quite a bit.
In the vein of shameless promotion, we have a podcast called Seekers and Scholars at the Mary Baker Eddy Library. You should all listen to it. But I'm hearing what sounds to be like slightly conflicting things. One on sort of the smaller independent, like shameless promotion, put your stuff in front of people, tweet things. But I'm also hearing on the larger scale that just good promotion isn't going to go. So stick with content that you like and that makes you happy. And so is there a line of over promotion of, especially since I work at an educational archives and library, that the Mary Baker Eddy Library, that we have a studio, we have a marketing group, and we have to fit ourselves in with the larger branding of the institution. So can you guys talk a little bit to that audience of educational institutions and where we fit in for promotion?
I'd be happy to try. So one of the things to consider is that I don't know where your particular part of like the archives fits into the larger university picture, but at least in my past experience, a large institution might have their own accounts and their own like methods of communication, and then smaller parts of a university might have their own as well, that the archives might be able to speak more about your show than the university at large, but it doesn't mean that you can't do both. They reach different audiences, they do different things. So that's one, just like internally where you are now. The second is going back to like the cross-promotion, everyone is friends in this still, that simply because it's about your archives and your particular institution, it does not mean that you can't reach out to other archives and other like similar institutions or places that do similar research to you. So I would say if you feel limited by what you currently have, it's an opportunity to be more creative about who else you can reach and market with. So, I mean, the other thing that I'm just gonna like put out there is even if you're limited by how many times a week or a month or however often the place that you work for can talk about this, no one is stopping you personally from doing that. Not that you need to be the shameless self-promoter only of your show, but there's some, like, in my mind, a little bit of opportunities for creative expansion that come from you and not just the place that you work for. So I don't know if that helped, but just some off-the-cuff thoughts.
Sure, this is probably kind of related to what you just said, but we understand that content is king, and I think we all agree. But for those of us that are the one-man band show, history in the making, ancient Greece, Athens. But for those of us that are just ourselves and we also do a full-time job, we just don't have that much time to market. So how do you prioritize that marketing when you do, if you have a limited window?
Yeah.
Big exhales and inhales.
I mean, social media really doesn't take that much time. Like when you're, well, it doesn't. I mean, it's very easy to just, like I have friends who are like, oh, I finally got Facebook off my phone. Like, God, I'm healthy now. And I'm like, I can't. Like, that's just, I can't do that. Like, I have to be able to, get an Instagram out. Is that, oh, I sound so old. I mean, post something on Instagram every day, get a tweet out, just kind of keep your voice going, because that's where you get the audience loyalty. People want to hear from you. And especially when you're this kind of one-man band and you're doing something, like make it clear that even though you take your content really seriously and you put a lot of energy into writing and, that you're also like a fun guy and that people want, anybody who's kind of tapping into the humor in your show, even if it's kind of, subtle, like then they'll see it in, it's nice to take an academic study and show that it can be funny, just kind of get the jokes in, but also get the wit in. And I feel like social media is really designed for those little nuggets of wit that you can, just kind of toss out there and just remind people that you're still there. Every time I publish an episode, I have like a list next to my computer of all of the websites that I need to hit, upload it on Reddit and get, make sure that my MailChimp goes out and just kind of like just get through the slog of all of the channels that I need to reach that are kind of, I like to believe now are like waiting to hear from me. And maybe that's like a psychological move that I need to tell myself that they're waiting to hear from me, but it makes it feel better than just kind of shouting into the void and just adding another tweet. Like that piece of it, I feel like, when it's just you and you have a full-time job, it's like you just have to put aside, cordon off time in your day that you just do your social media blast and then put it away.
And just real quick, because I know we have another question, but I'm sure I'm speaking to everyone and they're going to roll their eyes, but if you could schedule those tweets, if you could take an hour of a week and just have, schedule tweets or Facebook posts or, Reddit's a little bit different, but if you can find time to schedule those, take an hour a week and do that and still maintain your voice, then you can kind of have it running in the background and just make sure that, at least in my view, you're responding to your fans and things like that.
Related to that, I'm going to take just one step back from what both of them are saying and saying that just a little bit of planning will go a long way, that deciding that you're not going to do everything is also fine. And for each episode, you might try something a little bit different. So, like, just throwing this out there. This season of your show, dedicate yourself to making sure that your email newsletter is the best it can be. And that is the kind of thing where, like, the practice of doing it over and over again makes it less of a pressure on you. Or this season is when we're going to try Twitter seriously. And again, the planning to me, like this is my content strategist brain just sort of like going wild right now, which is all of the work that you're putting into an episode can be broken up into smaller, more like modular pieces that can work on social media or email or whatever. So it's that like amazing quote that you pulled out when you were editing, you're like, this quote is amazing. That quote is like part of your Twitter plan now. And like the description of your show, description of episodes, those are all things that like as individual pieces help you market yourself. Because again, when we keep on saying content is the king, it's that your content contains pretty much everything that you need already. It's just figuring out how to break it up into those pieces and get it out there into the world. So it does take time, but it's almost like shifting your focus a little bit while making the show, that it's not only what is going to get this thing done, but what are the most like standout amazing things from this episode that we want people to know and feel and we think will bring people in.
So we have time for 2 more questions.
Cool.
I'm wondering how you reach like advertisers and like if that, do you need like a certain amount of like plays that are happening, or like would you recommend reaching out like before you start releasing? Like,
What's your show?
I have a show about kind of like contemporary social issues. It's called Unwind the Line.
Cool.
But, yeah.
I would say, and again, we're belaboring this, but make sure the content's there, and that as you start to do it, you're going to eventually find advertiser interest. Even, if you're reaching a niche audience, I think there's an advertiser out there for it. If you feel there's a really great fit, I would say make sure that you have a show out there, or even like a pilot episode that you're very happy with, it's polished, and then reach out to a advertiser or an institution that you think might spend money with you. You kind of have to be a little shameless, right? There's going to be a lot of no's. I mean, me reaching out for Crosspromotion, I get a lot of no's even though I'm part of a network. So I would say make sure that you have a pilot or a series of episodes. You say, hey, this is the stuff I'm doing. I think that this could be a great fit. A sophisticated advertiser that's part of a big conglomerate is going to want metrics and stuff like that. So that's the tough part of this. But a niche coffee house by you or a local advertiser is probably going to be somewhat interested to at least engage in a conversation, and that might lead to investment further down the line.
I'm going to shamelessly plug the Bello Collective's Podcasting 101 collection right now, because there is, in fact, an entire article on how you set yourself up to actually reach out to people. And it's everything that Rob was just mentioning with, like, step by step, this is how you do this.
I would also ask yourself why you want an advertiser. That's something that I don't think we're allowed to say. And those of us with full-time jobs, like, I freely admit, like, I don't need to bring in $125 from doing a 60-second spot for a product that I don't really care about, when I make a salary at my job. Like, it's just, I think I started out thinking that if I had an advertiser, it made me sound legit, like the show was bona fide. And now it's like, I feel like, first of all, 60 seconds out of 25 minutes is a lot. Like, that's actually a lot of real estate to give up in your show. And I also find that, you know, if you're an advertiser, like, think about it from an advertiser's perspective. Like, you want to know when your content's getting out there, like when your product is getting shilled. And a really important piece for me, at least while I try to balance this full-time job and full-time job, like, you know, while I'm, you know, and kind of keep my sanity, like, being on somebody else's schedule is really stressful. And I actually, you know, this month I was supposed to put out an episode, and I couldn't, and it just didn't happen. And I, you know, like, that has repercussions when you have an advertiser who, you know, but at the same time, it's like, it's $100, you know, and it's like, my sanity is worth more to me than that. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like until you really are at a place where you feel like this income becomes more important than your sanity, then I would say that you know, maybe not try to chase advertising to legitimize your show. Because it will come as your show is legitimized on its own.
I also say that, like, grants and foundation support is also really huge. Yes. I did a podcast called The World in Words about language, and we were supported by NEH. And sure, writing an NEH grant proposal sucked, but but it was a great source of funds. Yep. Last question.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about strategies around release schedule. If it's important to get something out there every month, what kind of cadence you think is important. And then for those that are part of the networks, I just looked up both all your networks, and neither of your networks have a feed of all the podcast episodes that are coming out with it. So I was just curious in terms of how you at a sort of larger level are thinking about promoting, like, all the different sub-shows that are part of it.
You want to go?
You go first.
All right. Release schedule is really, it's important. I think it's you have to hit what your fans are expecting. Now, it's not saying you can't miss a month, but that means in your next episode that you come out, you explain what's happening, or you're engaging with that audience wherever they might find your show or your following. So I would say that it's something you should prioritize in the beginning. It's like, I'm going to do this every Monday. If it's twice a week, it depends on how much information you're looking to get out there. There's very popular shows that are once a month. You know, we have Dan Carlin, who's actually going to be here, and he does like once a year, right, or twice a year, and he gets tons of listens. So I think it depends on what you're going to do and make sure that you can deliver on that promise. So if you're like, I'm going to do a daily show, make sure that before you go live, you can hit those deadlines and you can hit that release schedule, because I think that is important, because that's when fans are going to want it. In terms of, I think you might have just called this out for a flaw, and you know, I think that because podcasting is so regular, and in terms of the shows, fans know when that show is coming out, that we're not really, at least from my view, I haven't really thought about, you know, putting out there like when the next episode's coming out, but maybe you just taught me something. So
yeah, in terms of release schedule for us, I mean, it's especially for a network when we have advertisers who expect, you know, delivery, our network is basically based on frequency. I mean, Stuff You Should Know has published an episode for the last 10 years every Tuesday and Thursday. So they've never missed an episode, regardless of when New Year's, you know, Hanukkah, anything falls. So for them, it's very important. Whereas Tamara, I totally understand where she's coming from and know that, you know, your sanity is definitely worth more than a podcast. But in terms of the release schedule on a broad sense, I think that we look at, as a network, yes, we have tons of great podcasts, but we feel like people connect more on the individual level than saying, hey, listen to this all these How Stuff Works podcasts. And so, like, from my experience, it's much more valuable to connect with that person and know that they're going to consistently listen to Stuff You Should Know, and we make sure that they know when they look through all of the publishing that has happened over the last 10 years, they see it happens every Tuesday and Thursday, just like Stuff You Missed in History class every Monday and Wednesday. And so I get where you're coming from, and in terms of, you know, if I was just starting out on a network, or I had a network that was a little more dependent on the name of the network versus our individual brands, I think that's a great idea. But for us, when I tell people that I work at how stuff works. I either get somebody freaking out at me or they have no idea what I'm talking about. And if I say stuff you should know, I say stuff you missed in history class, then they're, oh yeah, I know that. So for me, I find more value in the individual brand that is connecting to the person.
Can I just jump in real quick? Just one more thing. You can also bank episodes. So if you know you're going on a trip, or if you know it's gonna be a stressful month, try and find time to do 3 or 4 episodes so you can consistently get that release schedule out.
Super quick counterpoint. Sorry.
Please.
Just that I think that regularity is when you're independent. I will say this: when you don't have advertisers dependent on you, when you're independent, regularity matters a lot at the beginning. I think that you can let it go as you go, and that your audience will be there waiting for you. And that's, I started out on my website that I said I released every other week. I changed the website tag to say every 3rd week. Now I just took that line entirely off. And it's just like, you get an episode when you get one. And, you get what you get, and you don't get upset. Like, it's actually been, it's been okay to make less, instead of pushing out content when it wasn't there or I didn't have time. So
Thank you so much to everybody.